You look like Marilyn Manson and Bruce Jenner's weird love child. I have a face for success! Hello old-timers and newcomers, I am Cole Scratches, and thank you for joining me to take a look at what I was sent. I'm sorry I've been gone for a couple of weeks. Something happened that took me out of commission for a while, and I had to put all of this on the back burner for a bit. I'm sorry if you were eagerly awaiting an update from me, but sometimes life just happens, and this is primarily something that I do for fun. I can put it on the back burner if I have to. I'd like for it to take off someday, but I don't see it happening. I certainly never expected to be taken seriously enough where someone would send me a screener of a film that hasn't even been released yet. But after a very long and heavy conversation with Michelle Nesk, suddenly I was in possession of O Unilateralis. Let me take you back to 2015. I don't know what was happening back then, because I was breaking apart and picking my pieces back up on a daily basis, but unbeknownst to me, screener copies of O Unilateralis were being distributed to critics and film festivals, only to set the world of found footage ablaze. The reviews of the film are almost exclusively positive, and the community waited with bated breath for it to finally come out. And they kept waiting, and waiting, with nothing to come of it, and little by little the hype and hearsay and rumors died down. And so began the legend of the highest rated found footage movie never to be released. Or at least one of them. I think maybe Wikufi was just as praised, only to never be released, but I'm not kidding when I say this is one of the holy grails of found footage, and I feel incredibly privileged to have been trusted with a copy of it. With that in mind, this review will contain no clips. There's not even gonna be any sound bites, it's just gonna be my professional oratory skills and a couple of screenshots that I snagged from the film. Also, you may notice that I'm being a bit more serious in this review, and that's because this film is very hard to joke about. O Unilateralis begins familiarly enough, with a man, a camera, and a road trip. 3 friends come together for a pleasant getaway to the Blue Mountains of Oregon, but it's not that simple. Only the 2 men know each other, with the third, a lady, tagging along the band of brothers, unsuspecting of the danger she has put herself in. This is a movie about rape. And I don't mean that there is a scene in this movie, I mean it's what the entire movie revolves around. And this is not I Spit on Your Grave, where the act is an excuse for the female lead to go on an androcidal rampage. No. It is central to the horror of this movie. I am not going to recommend attempting to seek this movie out. I am simply going to tell you what this movie is like, and then leave it to you to decide whether or not this is something you need in your life. I was not prepared for the direction this movie took. And I'm warning you right now, if you do not feel comfortable with a horror movie going there, then don't watch this. Turn off this review, go watch something happier, like Confessions of a Schutzstaffel. But if you're still morbidly curious, or think you can persevere knowing this movie is going there, then I can't dissuade you. The movie opens to an exposition dump that explains the video was recovered by Willow Creek Sheriff's Department at a crime scene in the Blue Mountains, and overlaid this is a woman explaining the movie's title, in case someone in the audience never played The Last of Us. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis is a parasitic fungus that attacks the nervous system and changes the host behavior. The implication being what's coming is tied to the parasite. It also ties the movie to a universe shared by most of Michelle Nesk's movies, where zombies and doppelgangers feature prominently. But you wouldn't know that watching this movie, it stands entirely on its own. with the push of a button we're brought to a humble crazy wall in the office of a former deputy at the Willow County Sheriff's Department. He informs us he came across a video camera while out hunting, but before he could report it in, government agents had seized jurisdiction and he chose to keep the footage. He reveals it to us now because he believes it proves a development the government wishes to quiet down at the expense of the public, and it's important for the footage to get out, but warns us the content is disturbing. You wanna suck my cock, church girl? This is how we're introduced to Troy Murphy, our camera holder for this excursion. His posturing accounts to a middle ground between fantasy and practice, preparing for the moment of truth. The church girl in question is a friend of a friend he's never met before, but Scout's motto and all that, it's only gonna be him, fuckface queef, and the girl, of course. I mean, that's favorable odds if ever there was. Guess what role he fulfills later? He's a sexist bore with the presence of mind of a toddler, and the entire film is set from his perspective as he's trapped in a car with his best friend and a girl. That should give you an idea of how awkward and uncomfortable this movie gets. Speaking of his best friend, that's Keith, or as Troy likes to call him, Queef, or Fuckface. They clearly have an almost brotherly friendship where they can be as rude as they want to each other and it doesn't matter. It's kind of sweet really, but while Troy takes full advantage of this, Keith is more restrained and considerate, which immediately makes him the more likable one of the two. Ironically, without Troy, I probably wouldn't even remember Keith's name. Case in point, the third member of this impending shipwreck is not yet among them, so Troy decides to seize the moment and square out the ground rules. He does ask her name and how Keith knows her. She's a classmate, and of course his intentions towards her. Does he want to fuck her? Keith isn't exactly keen on answering a question like that, but he thinks she's sweet. That's okay with Troy, all he took from that conversation was she's on the market. Hell, maybe the both of them could share her. Keith balks at that suggestion because no, she would not be up for that, but that doesn't bother Troy. As far as he's concerned, it doesn't matter if she is. And yes, that is exactly how Troy puts it, but this is what I mean. Troy is such a monumental asshole. He makes Keith look good. But he's also the far more interesting character of the two. I generally don't mind a villain being the whole reason that I pay attention to a movie, but in this movie I do take issue with it. I don't want the only reason I like the good guy to be that he's as interesting as a packing peanut. Topping the list of characters that I hate in a movie is any character that reminds of me. And with the masculine quota of the character roster fulfilled, it's time to introduce this movie's damsel, Abigail Wallace. She met Keith through school and decided to come with him to spread her wings and have fun. She grew up in a very sheltered community and family, and this is her breaking away from that safety and embracing life as an adult, capable of making her own decisions. That sounds good and romantic, but she is also innocent to the extreme. Imagine for a moment someone's reading about an assault that took place somewhere and they say the woman should have known better. Abby is the embodiment of that statement. Between her naivete, uncertainty, and desire to rebel against her upbringing, she is pretty much cookie cut to be made someone's victim. And I know what you're thinking, that sounds perfect to make fun of. A bimbette so stupid she makes every wrong decision she could, the jokes write themselves. No! Not this movie. And this is not me going woke and becoming afraid of opening my mouth in case I offend someone. No, this is me already finding it very difficult to make a joke of this movie. I'm not touching her. According to Nesk, Abby is the embodiment of women living with not feeling safe but pretending they do. And the film does a good job of capturing that sentiment, but now I'm putting the cart before the horse. Most of the car ride consists of Troy upstaging Abby and Keith, but it also illustrates their different personalities, with Keith becoming increasingly annoyed with Troy but still accepting his running motor mouth, and Abby remaining very quiet unless Troy all but demands an answer of her. The moments when Troy gets bored and shuts up are the most pleasant ones, but it's still him who furthers the story. Not long after taking off, Troy suddenly has the idea to make a horror film. I mean, they're going out into the woods, they have a camera, they can do some cheap indie Blair Witch knockoff, and he does not let go of this idea. Keith agrees, if only to keep the peace, and Abby buckles to peer pressure even though she has never even seen a horror movie before. However, before long their journey is interrupted by a police blockade. There's been a horrible accident. So horrible, the entire road is closed off. So devastating, there's nothing short of a miracle. No one was hurt, and there isn't a single visible trace of it. They've invested too much time in the journey for it all to go to waste, so Keith studies the map for a side road they can use. It leads them to camp in the forest and commune with nature, by which I mean they smoke a joint around the campfire. Even Abby, for the first time in her life. I really wish I could show clips of this movie, because the dialogue and facial expressions and atmosphere all do more to convey the subtleties of this film than I can reiterate, and still make it interesting. But Abby makes the first pop culture reference she's done all film, with her knowing pot really means marijuana, because she was made to watch Reefer Madness at church. So Troy asks her directly how it's at all possible she knows so little about the world as she does. And she very awkwardly explains. She grew up in a farm in Iowa and was very sheltered. No TV or music or anything that could prepare her for the world outside of that community, with only occasional movies shown at church. Educational films such as Reefer Madness. This mostly explains her very subdued, very literal attitude. Having grown up in this isolated environment and cut off from the world, she doesn't understand metaphor, she doesn't understand slang. Keith and Troy may as well be speaking a different language from her. Not to mention this, having grown up in this safe little bubble, she is coming at the world with this very naive and very trusting attitude. This makes what's going to happen all the more tragic, because this is not one of those movies where the characters really should know better, and they make stupid decisions just because the plot demands it. No, here the characters react exactly the way you would expect them to. What makes this so tragic is basically this means what's coming is inevitable. They react exactly the way you would expect them to. Exactly the way they should, given who they are. And this is especially tragic because not only has something like this definitely happened in real life, it's also definitely going to happen again. I don't know how to make that funny. The weed does help to alleviate some of the tension built across the day, and you relax just a bit before Troy has to go and screw it up yet again by talking about the horror film. He starts spitballing ideas, mostly to himself, because he decides with their limited resources they should make a revenge film. A specific type of revenge film, and he casts himself as the perpetrator and Abby as the victim. And after he's forced himself upon her, she will take violent revenge upon him. With this plan in the air, and Troy detailing what exactly revenge horror is to Abby, the tension around the campfire is as pleasant as a pit of syringes. Keith does try, very ineffectually, to assert maybe it's not entirely appropriate to involve Abby in something like that, but because Troy all but demands an answer from her, she pretends to be fine with it and allows for Keith to tie her hands, get on her knees, and Troy to open his mouth. Do you want to suck my cock, church girl? Did you catch that subtle clue that Troy may be dangerous? Thankfully, Abby does speak up and they abort. Keith unties her hands and they go back to staring at the campfire, with Troy decidedly disappointed, and Keith decidedly disappointed in Paul, and Abby really sorry she ruined the fun. Am I allowed to be frustrated with Abby? The next day, Abby is out cold in her first hangover, which Troy takes to mean he can talk like she's not even in the room. While Keith took to knowing how sheltered Abby is as a sign maybe they should be a bit careful with her, Troy remembers what he's heard about the most innocent girls growing up to be the biggest sluts. This is an important clue that Troy may not just be a skeevy prick, but completely disconnected from reality. This train of thought is halted by the first clue that the horror of this movie may reach beyond the confines of this interior, as they come across an abandoned truck, covered in blood. Whoever left it behind is nowhere to be seen, but they need to tell someone, so at the first and best driveway, Keith steps out to find someone and leaves Troy alone with Abby. He leaves Troy alone with Abby. That clip is from the trailer, so I can show it, but unless it's plot relevant, I'm just gonna stop describing the character interactions, because by now I think you get it. Troy is being a creep towards Abby, she meekly accepts it, and Keith judges but doesn't stop him. And the entire movie basically amounts to Troy testing the waters and forcing us to be part of it. You may wonder why Keith doesn't stop him, and the movie does answer that. Kind of. Abby stirs in her sleep. Troy retreats and Keith returns without noticing what the man was up to. The house was abandoned. Not decrepit, but vacated, as if whoever lived there didn't even bother to pack a bag but simply bolted. Could it have something to do with the car? Maybe, but there's no one to contact about it here, so they just have to keep going until they reach town. So they do, but they don't have much for it. It's eerily quiet as they enter town. There's not one person walking the street. There's cars parked in the lots, plants in the windows, shining lights, groomed lawns, but no sheriff. No townsfolk. The entire damn town is empty. Where the hell is everybody? Most of the film is set in the Blue Mountains, but this bit was filmed in Skycomish, Washington. And at the time, the town was experiencing a severe storm, and the entire population had relocated to a shelter, leaving the town looking like, well, the set of a horror movie. Interestingly, at the same time they were filming in the Blue Mountains, there was a wildfire moving through the area. I'm not religious, but I think something may have had a hand in getting this movie made. This is also the first time I've had a bit of trivia about a film I didn't pick up from IMDb, so yay! According to Nesk, the town was symbolic of the movie's threat on several levels. Not only does it hint there is something wrong about the area they're in, it also foreshadows the isolation survivors experience, as well as their helplessness in the moments preceding it. Because if a predator is given opportunity, there is nothing to stop them from acting on it. This movie has a lot of layers and a lot of symbolism to it, as you can tell. Abby is symbolic of women not feeling safe. Troy is symbolic of the threat they're all under, and Keith is symbolic of enablers who allow for predators to act. Think of it like the difference between murder and manslaughter. One is intentional and the other isn't, but they both amount to the same thing. That sounds like the film is suggesting all men are responsible for all rapes, which would be offensive to the nth degree. But what Nesk is actually getting at is if a predator decides to act, there is very little to do to stop them. I think. But it's fair to say if you're the kind of person who is easily offended by generalizations, this is not the film for you. Troy is enthralled by the emptiness of the place, and after scoping it out, he decides they should camp here for the night. Keith, realizing if an entire town abandons ship, it's probably for a damn good reason, such as, I don't know, a coming storm? Is not enthusiastic about the idea, but surprisingly, even Abby thinks it sounds exciting. Insert Silent Hill reference here. They do manage to convince Keith, and so they set up camp near the rail yard for the spooky adventure that is camping in a ghost town. But what neither of them knows is Troy scouted out the area for places to be alone with Abby. Night comes and they swap stories over a burning trash can. Apparently Troy would stand up on Keith's behalf in the face of bullies when they were in high school, and they have been friends ever since. It sounds good, like even though Troy is vulgar and senseless, he's still a good friend. But he also goes into detail about what a bully did to make Keith try, humiliating Keith in front of Abby to make himself look good. What a fucking legend. This drives Keith to bed and leaves Abby alone with Troy, who suggests they go for a walk. She's drunk heavily, which Troy did not have a problem with, and so her judgment is compromised enough to say yes. And eventually he reiterates a question he asked by the fire but never got an answer to. Has she had sex? And this is the moment of the movie where I feel like Abby crosses the line from blissfully naive to downright stupid. From the beginning of the film, she has been afraid of Troy. She has been uncomfortable in his presence. So you would think she would be a bit more guarded against him. And yet, she decides to answer his question with a question of her own. And she asks, what is sex like? I'm in pain from discomfort. This leads to Troy very awkwardly and creepily trying to explain it to Abby, and I'm not going into detail about that conversation because fuck that. No, I'm skipping it to the end where Abby runs away, only for the both of them to hear something. It sounds like howling, but not from wolves, it's too shrill. It doesn't even sound like dogs, it sounds like people. The next day starts as always, with Troy opening his mouth. Only Keith seems to be unusually quiet. He's tense and short-tempered, and neither Troy nor Abby really understands why. When they stop by a graveyard, Troy suggests this would be an excellent location for a zombie film, and Keith reluctantly agrees. Previously, he did suggest making a zombie movie instead of a revenge film, mostly to keep the peace and to tide Troy over, but it was his suggestions, so he has less to oppose to about that. However, when Troy suggests seeing if they can make Abby take her shirt off, Keith has had enough and tells him outright if he asks that of her, he's gonna beat him, and he demands to know why the hell Troy is acting like this. This is an interesting turn of events for a couple of reasons. First of all, it suggests that Troy doesn't usually act like this, or if he does, it's never been to this extreme. But at the same time, Keith has presumably known Troy for at least 10 years, and yet he hasn't had a problem with how Troy is acting until now. At the same time still, there is Abby, who, despite growing up in this incredibly sheltered, almost Puritan household, decided to go with two boys she barely knows. And remember, this movie is supposed to have something to do with parasites that changes the host's behavior. This uncertainty about who is and isn't infected, it reminds me a little bit of The Thing. I like it, but unlike The Thing, I have no doubt whatsoever about who the enemy is. They do set up a basic scene from a zombie movie, only for Keith and Abby to stumble and hurt themselves. And as if to hammer home Troy's ulterior motive with the film is to somehow get into Abby's pants, he loses interest as soon as it's over and asserts they should get moving. Keith wants to stay and look around, relax and maybe have some fun, but Troy manipulates Abby into agreeing with him by suggesting they get to the cabin so she can rest her head after the fall. Back in the car, Troy keeps pressing the issue of the movie and what they'll have Abby do, and I think the only reason Keith doesn't tear his head off is that Abby is present. She, meanwhile, puts all the blame for the tension on herself, and promises she can do whatever they want her to, but it'd be nice if they could pull over by a rest stop. While she's gone, Troy finally pushes Keith far enough for him to confront Troy about the way he is acting. This is the bit of the film I'm really sad I can't show a clip from, because it's insanely satisfying to hear Keith finally call Troy on his bullshit, but the best I can do is summarize it. In Keith's own words, Troy has never acted like this, and Keith's feeling about as scared of him as Abby does. To which Troy replies, "What are you talking about? I act like this all the time. It's called being a man." In place of Keith, allow me to say, "Do you hear the shit that's coming out of your mouth?" And that's when Keith drops the bomb. He says the one thing that manages to penetrate the thick, hairy surface of Troy's forehead. He says, "If you and I had met last week, we sure as hell wouldn't be friends." And Troy seems genuinely hurt by that. Thank you, Keith. Thank you so much for saying that. You have no reason to be ashamed, even if Troy insists you explain what that meant. That dung beetle has had it coming for a long time. Unfortunately, before he can elaborate on it, Abby slams into the window. She's crying, and her hands are covered in blood. Abby is barely in the car before Keith floors it out of there. Soon as they get out of the cabin, they're gonna call the cops, but first they need Abby to tell them what exactly happened. There was an old woman in the bathroom, and basically as soon as she saw Abby, she lunged at her, spitting blood all over her face and trying to bite her. So Abby pushed her off and ran outside. And Troy, ever being the voice of concern and righteousness, react to this with shock that Abby just left the woman in the bathroom. Okay, this goes beyond just being thirsty. The man has an actual vendetta against this woman, and I want to know why! Arriving at the cabin, they find there's no phone for them to call the cops. They have to find one somewhere else. So Keith leaves Troy alone with Abby. Actually, you might think you know where this is going, but don't be so sure. In an unexpected twist, Troy decides to hold Keith up for a moment and apologizes. For everything. He doesn't know where it's all coming from, but he doesn't want to lose his best friend over it. He's sorry for everything he's done to him, and he's gonna tone it down, and they don't have to do the movie anymore. They can just have a nice, good time at the cabin, and maybe do the movie some other time. And this all sounds really, really sweet. Except the reason I know all this is because Troy set the camera to capture the whole performance. But it works. Keith accepts his apology and they move on. And he leaves Troy at the cabin. With Abby. And a random motivational plaque that states, "What happens in the cabin stays in the cabin." And this is it. It's now it happens. I'm not going to talk about it because it was bad enough having to sit through it. I'm not going to give you the play-by-play commentary. And I understand there are a lot of people out there who are disappointed that I won't go into detail about what happens in that scene. But to these people, allow me to say, fuck you, eat my shit, die! I really wish I could say it was at the last second, but he was going for a good minute before Keith caught him. A development that Nesk points out is exceedingly rare in any real-world scenario, and a little bit of Hollywood compared to the mostly realistic tone of the movie. But considering how utterly miserable the movie has been until now, I think I can let it slide. Especially when Keith proceeds to beat the shit out of a incoherently babbling Troy before ushering Abby out the door and leaving Troy to lick his bruised ego. If you didn't think he was a piece of shit as is, Troy now goes into a long-winded drunken rant about how, if she didn't want it, then why would she come all the way out here with two guys she doesn't know? And it's not that he wanted her exclusively, he was willing to share her with his best friend, because that's what best friends do. But he didn't want that. No, he wanted her to himself. Wait, wasn't there a subplot about parasites or something? Even in his drunken stupor and battered frame, it's easy enough for Troy to find the car, and sure enough, there they are. The roof light is on so he can see them clear as day, and yup, he got the bitch in his lap. Wait, what? Surprise, motherfucker! Troy knocks on the window to call Keith out, and boy is he out. Completely out, actually. He doesn't even open his eyes to look at Troy, and Abby just keeps licking around his neck. It's like they don't even notice Troy is there. They're fucking ignoring him? Well, he tears open the door and stops when Keith's head rolls to the side. Half his face is gone. It's nothing but an open wound, exposed muscle and pouring blood. Right, so what happened was the woman at the rest stop infected Abby and she turned feral, and not one of the events for the past hour and a half have had anything to do with the parasites. And Keith saved her from Troy, and for that he's turned into zombie kibble. Right. With her full attention, Abby turns towards Troy, and for the first time the tables are turned. He is scared as she menaces him with that blank, unemotional expression she stares at him with, completely oblivious to the pitiful excuses and defenses he stammers out of before she lunges at him and he runs into the forest. When he thinks he's far enough in, he turns off the light and tries to stay quiet. The occasional whimper escapes his lips, and that's when he hears the sounds of clicking and breathing getting louder all around him, as if he's surrounded by a swarm of insects. And when he sees the eyes glowing in the dark, he hears Abby whisper, "Troy, there is no God." He barely has time to turn on the light before she pounces and tears his throat out. This isn't the end, it's just the beginning. Through his investigation, the deputy believes the events caught on film are the result of a weaponized variant of Cordyceps UNILATERALIS, created by the US government. During a controlled exposure, it got out of control, or maybe it was never meant to be contained, and it is currently spreading across the world, even though the government is doing its best to keep information about this silent. He released this footage, hoping it might help someone, but he couldn't ignore the story the footage told. Not because it was tied up with the proof it was happening, but he's not sure how it's going to help. Even if the footage was out there, who would it help? More than that, while the lives of these 3 people were tied up with the effects of the conspiracy, by itself it didn't affect them. This world of secrets and suffering, if it was possible, does it even deserve to be saved? Can it be saved? He can answer that. He turns to the camera, he picks up his gun, and he says, "We can try to save the world, but we won't." And then he shoots himself in the head. What a cheerful ending! This is probably the hardest review I have ever had to make. As a rule, I don't like movies that try to say something about real life, because I'm an existentialist at heart, and I think real life is too chaotic for a movie to be a reliable assessment of it. But mostly it's because films that do this are often very embarrassing, deluded and patronizing. So I stick to simple, dumb fun that doesn't try to do more than tell a captivating story. UNILATERALIS is an exception to that rule. It's easy to call a horror movie character stupid and even say they deserve what's coming to them. Nesk seems to have zoomed in on that sentiment and tried to give a serious answer. Abby is frightfully naive and sheltered, and clearly doesn't understand the danger she's in, but it's not played for cheese or dumbed down. She actually comes across as very real, as a person you could meet and would be easy prey for a predator like Troy. And that makes the horror she's about to experience all the more tragic. Because not only does it feel extremely real, I'm also not sure what could have been done to stop it. Having been raised in what I gather was a thoroughly judgmental religious community, Abby wants to break away from the whirlpool of shame and fear-mongering, and so she ignores what you and I would call common sense and assume any discomfort she feels is just the ghost of her upbringing rearing its ugly head. Troy was a perfect douche for the entire film, with a self-image that crossed the border into delusion. Keith is a nice guy who has known Troy for his entire life and thinks the best of him despite how boorish he is, and doesn't suspect what Troy is capable of. It's easy to say Keith or Abby should have known better, but given how all of the pieces fit together, I think saying that means not really understanding this movie. What makes it stand out is how real it is. This movie isn't served with extra cheese. There's no attention-grabbing editing tricks or overplayed cliches or characters that comes off as caricatures, no. If I had seen this and been told it was real, I would have believed it. On that note, the movie feels a lot like a parable, not meant to be entertaining but to make you think without teaching you a specific lesson. Again and again I went over how it may have been prevented and what could have been done differently to not lead where it did, and every time I realized that's not what the characters would have done. Nesk did an excellent job characterizing the cast, giving them personality and motivation without it feeling contrived or forced. As I got to know them, they reacted to each other the way I'd expect them to. It's funny, but I think making any correct decision would have seemed more contrived than them making all the bad ones. And that is masterful storytelling, making the dumbest choices seem sensible within their context. Having grown up with horror movies brimming with familiar cliches and tropes and stereotypes, I was kept guessing until the end just where this movie was going. I thought maybe Troy would become likable towards the end, or Keith revealed he was worse than Troy. I even suspected Abby to be revealed as a twist bad guy, with her baiting either of the guys to spread the parasites. And whenever the film seemed about to do something cliched, Nesk would have it turned on its head into something cynical and depressing. It sounds like a perfect 10 on a scale of 11, maybe even higher. But despite how disturbing and uncomfortable, tense and devastating, masterfully told and captivating this movie is, I can't come up with a single thing about it that would make me recommend it. It's the most paradoxical film I have ever come across. By every objective measure, it's a triumph of filmmaking, and should Michelle Nesk ever release it, it's a film that would put her on the map next to names like Hooper and Kubrick. But it's so thoroughly unpleasant, I don't see anyone enjoying this movie. I know, it's a horror movie, it's supposed to be unpleasant, but it doesn't give you a single reason for why you should watch until the end. There's no sense of conflict with the characters standing up to the threat, there is no end to their journey they're struggling to reach, there's no reward waiting for them at the end, they are simply going about, ignorant about what's coming until it does happen. And there isn't even anything about the journey that makes it worthwhile. They don't do anything interesting, and their interactions only swing between amicable and uncomfortable, with the only thing keeping my attention being how uncomfortable it could get before something happened to take my attention away from it. And then there is the ending. Wow, did that feel out of place. That said, it's too captivating to be boring, but what captivates me is just how impressively miserable it gets. The story is thin, the events are sparse, all it really had to keep my attention was the characters, and I didn't even really like the characters. I liked Keith and Abby in contrast to Troy. Like any good villain, he's the one who made the movie interesting, and without him, both of them are kind of boring. I cared about what happened to Abby because it's what the whole movie revolves around, and she was so innocent I didn't want her to go through it. But beyond that, there wasn't really that much to her. Uninteresting characters can work if the movie is fast-paced and fun, but it's really slow and depressing. I do understand why that is. Nesk wanted to capture the sensation of what it's like to be a survivor, and while I can't speak from experience, I do think she succeeded, so far as a film can convey something like that. All in all, I think it's a very important movie. I think it should be studied in film schools by both directors and actors. I think it's a catharsis for trauma to let survivors know that someone understands what they've been through. It's both a warning and an example of how a predator may think and operate. And I'm not ashamed to admit, this movie got to me. The reason this film isn't entertaining is because it's not meant to be, I get that, but for me, personally, the most important part of a story-driven feature film is how enjoyable it is. And from that perspective, O Unilateralis fails on every single measure. I already talked about how dull the characters are, and the story is wafer thin. A girl is raped during a trip with two guys she doesn't know. And that's it. The entire film amounts to waiting for that to happen, with very little else going on. It's a slow burn film, which doesn't have to be a bad thing, but I spent the whole thing waiting for a conflict that would grow Troy as a more likable character, which never happened. It was a simple matter of persevering, hoping for a climax to release my anxiety. And yes, the movie is very tense, but it's not the tension of being at the edge of your seat with your eyes glued at the screen and waiting for what'll happen next. It's the stress of feeling nauseous and wanting to turn the thing off. And on that note, it doesn't even work very well as a horror movie. For all the tension and horror this movie exuded, there is one central flaw with the horror of it. And this will probably be the most uncomfortable and controversial opinion I have ever shared. In fiction, rape is many things. It's distressing, it's uncomfortable, it's disgusting, it's horrifying. But it doesn't scare me. I'm drawing a hard line between fiction and reality at this point, as I don't see rape in real life the same as I do in fiction. At the same time, I realize this is like saying I don't find gore scary. Not only does that vary from person to person, it also comes down to what's done with it. But that's the thing. Not only don't I find assault very frightening just in general, I've also seen far worse. The very first movie I reviewed was Cannibal Holocaust, and this movie doesn't hold a candle to that. As hard as this movie tried to make the prospect of rape frightening, the build-up was worse than the act itself. I feel no shame in admitting this movie had me in a crisis of confidence for days after watching it, questioning what kind of person I am, questioning the opinions I hold. I even started questioning how I see women, for me to not be as disturbed by this movie as I felt I should have been. It took me a while, but eventually I realized I really am just too jaded to be very devastated by this movie, but having this reaction still proves Michelle Nesque's skill as a director. She made me feel guilty about not being more afraid. And that's how I feel about O Unilateralis as a whole. It's a technique demo of the highest order. You study it the way you would a work of art in a museum. I want to dissect how it was done, I want to pick apart all the little nuance and implications and nerd out over it with my peers. But that's all it is. It's a film you think about, it's not a film you love. It's a film you study in media to become a better actor or director. It's a film you interpret and try to learn from without a clear answer to the question, or even what the question is. It's a film that does everything right, but forgets the simple most important part of any movie. A reason to like it. I sentence O Unilateralis to a 7 on a scale of 11. For all the rave reviews this movie has gotten, I just want to say, the scale of 11 really is a scale of 10, and even now I'm still tempted to rate it higher than I have, but I just can't ignore the fact that I will never want to watch this movie again. Thank you all for watching. I have been Core Scratchins, and I hope you will see me again next time to take another look at what I found.